What's going on, everyone? My name is Rosendo. Welcome back to my channel, and we are back with another video. And today we are back with another track review, episode 9 of our track review series. This time taking a look at Save My Love by Kygo, Gryffin, and Khalid. New track today by probably the biggest artist we've looked at up to this point. I know we've looked at Illenium, we've looked at John Summit, but I want to say Kygo and definitely Khalid are going to be above that. So we have a brand new track review for you guys. Definitely a genre and a sound we haven't really explored yet. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos, but without further ado, let's hop into Spotify. All right, we are back in Spotify with Save My Love, Kygo, Khalid, and Gryffin. 2026 release, February 20th, so just came out. Already over 1 million streams, 3-minute and 30-second song. You guys already know how I feel about shorter songs. Would I call this short? It depends. It depends. I know I said John Summit's track was short, but it definitely didn't feel that way from the experience perspective. And I delivered everything you could. 3:30 is kind of right around the average mark in my eyes. I like longer tracks. I don't think 3:30 is too short, but I think it can lean towards short depending on how you deliver the experience. Now, before we get into the track review, let's talk about the preface. Let's talk about what I'm going to be emphasizing today, because there's not actually many things I'm going to be emphasizing about this track. One of the interesting things I want to do is I want to kind of compare how this track kind of measures up to the previous episode, which was The Longest Night by Nurko. If you haven't checked out that track review, definitely check it out. It's a little bit longer. It's a little bit more all over the place because I know so much about Nurko and I wanted to share a little bit of everything that I got out of that track. And the big takeaway is I'm going to be comparing some characteristics of that track and this track to have you guys hopefully compare and contrast. I saw a lot of things in that video that I don't think make a lot of sense, that they just make sense in my head. I'm going to say a lot of things about this track in this video that also just makes sense in my head, but if you at least have a reference point for a track that I'm referring to that does certain things in my eyes well, then you'll have a reference point for when I describe my impressions of this track. Other than that, I don't believe there's anything to go over in the preface. We haven't looked at Kygo, we haven't looked at Khalid, we haven't really looked at Gryffin yet. Obviously the biggest artist we've reviewed up to this point, but again, I don't think that there's anything more to go over, and I definitely want to get straight to it, so why don't we actually listen to the track at this point. As a reminder, there will be no audio playing for copyright reasons, but we can all listen to the track at the same time, with Save My Love by Kygo, Khalid, and Gryffin in 3, 2, 1. First thing you get is a guitar and some chords that feel, I actually don't know if that's a 1-5-6-4, but 4 bars on the intro that I'm definitely going to bring up at the end, going straight into the vocals. Khalid's vocals obviously processed very nicely. Khalid, great voice as well. And we're setting the stage for the track. 8 bars there, kick comes in, instruments come in. We get a slightly different kind of melody for the vocals. Drawn out vocals and things like that, a little bit more spacey, but still a very active track. I've mentioned that before. Picking up the vocals a little bit more. Wants to definitely feel a little bit emotional. I want you guys to pay attention to the lyrics and kind of the soul of the track, if you will. Listen to this melody right here. There's what feels like kind of your hook at this point right here, into a lower energy section that seems kind of a little bit more characteristic of, Kygo, right? That pre-drop section, especially with those pianos and things like that. There's your build-up into your drop. How many phrases are we getting here? 2, 3, 4. Obviously 8 bars. I mean, I already knew this. I just wanted to double check. A little bit more hi-hats on the second half of that phrase. Straight into the second verse. We do get that progression that I really like if you saw my simplest progression video. Nice ad-libs on the vocals, but again, really nice kind of atmosphere on those vocals. Definitely more active. But again, listen to the melodies, listen to the vocals. Same vocals with more emphasis on it. Another low energy section, more stripped, I should say. And then we'll get that pre-drop build up again. Same melody as before. Into that pre-drop build-up area right here. Feels pretty symmetrical from the first drop. Verses and everything, melodies really as well. Obviously, you have different rhythms and percussion in the second verse, but melodies feel the same. There's your drop, which should last 16 bars here, if I remember correctly. Yep, hi-hats come in. And then the second phrase. Right here. Pretty standard progression that you see in a lot of tracks around this genre that kind of re-include the vocals for the second phrase of the second drop. And of course, you end the track right after the second drop. And that was Save My Love by Kygo, Khalid, and Gryffin. All right, so what are my impressions of this track? What is my review for this track? If you saw, I believe, the Casbo video, episode number 7, I want to say, All This Time by Casbo, I mentioned that I wanted there to be a point where I chose a track, I committed to it, and I didn't like it all that much. In that video, I had chosen a track by a big artist, and I just really didn't like the track, and I just decided to scrap that, and I said in that video, maybe there won't be a time where I choose a track that I don't like and I still review it. Today is kind of that day where we're looking at what feels like the most average track we've gotten up to this point. If we talk about some of the average tracks I've reviewed, we are looking at, I believe, the Starships remix of, what was it? The Starships remix of Rocketeer. We have Jai Wolf's Nothing Left to Lose, and I want to say I'm missing one. And Deepest Veils by Last Heroes. Those were all the tracks that I gave a 5 out of 10. This is kind of that realm that we're dealing with when we look at Save My Love. This is going to be a little bit different though, because my rating, what goes into my rating has to do a lot with what I talked about last video. In those previous videos and the videos I just mentioned, the other tracks that I gave a 5, I mentioned that there were characteristics about those tracks that I liked, but even then they still stuck out to me as more average tracks. What do I think about this track? What are my impressions? First of all, I described it as very active, right? Especially when you look at two things, at least not necessarily two things that make it active, but two things that A, make it active, and B, make it a little bit more average. As a reminder, when I say active, and I'm saying this as a reminder because it's not an idea that I fully elaborated on yet, active tracks tend to be the ones that are a little bit more commercial. They have a lot of things going on. They kind of keep your attention a little bit more. They have elements here and there and in the right places. And I've used the term inactive to describe tracks that are going to be a little bit more artistic, that have a little bit more emphasis on having the listener pay attention and be immersed and kind of being really drawn into the experience. The same way I would kind of define inactive and active movies, where inactive movies are ones where the directors are usually a little bit more serious. They focus on a few core elements and they try to get you really immersed. And active movies are the ones that move a little bit faster. They're usually around 90 minutes, I want to say. I'm making that number up. But, you know, a lot of them tend to be around that time. And they kind of have plot points that follow very similar kind of patterns, very similar directions. What am I getting at when I review this track? You have the 4-bar intro, something that I mentioned in the last video where I mentioned that a lot of times pacing gets cut in half nowadays, something I don't really like. You have pretty standard verses, at least for these artists. I don't really have many problems with the verses for the most part, into an 8-bar drop where you get the second verse and you get a 16-bar drop, where one thing that I did want to mention that I did not go over in last video, in the Nurko video, is oftentimes I give artists a lot of props and a lot of credit for extending the second drop. But I need to clarify something, because especially if you look at it was definitely true in the John Summit video and Lights Go Out. It was less true in the Nurko video, but subjectively, I definitely found it to be a little bit more true. But let me clarify what I say when I give artists prop for extending the experience and the progression, rather. In the John Summit Lights Go Out video, one of the nice things that John Summit did is he introduced a pretty standard, but albeit nice, but it's still a nice drop at the end of the day in the first half of the track. But when you take a switch up, when you interrupt it, when you go a different direction, it allows you to then reintroduce that drop later and extend it to ultimately give the audience the experience and the drop and the sound they deserve. When tracks aren't interrupted as much, it's a very common practice and frankly standard progression at this point to have a first drop to be, well, we're going to say 8 bars, but what I've since described as following the pacing of the track, and having the second drop to be just double that. Well, we're going to say 16 bars, but again, double the pacing of the track. It's something that Nurko did in Nurko's track, which I didn't talk about in the video, but actually, after watching it again, I really wish I would have emphasized it more, because I do give props to Nurko for extending that drop, but it has a little bit more to do with the design of the track and the design of not necessarily the experience, because I had my gripes about the experience, but about kind of the experience of the actual production and layout and the sound design and all of that stuff, but definitely not as what didn't feel as artistic and intentional as something like the Let's Go Out video. The reason I bring that up here is because this is definitely an area where you look at some of the more kind of commercial components of this track, which are, again, the 4-bar intro, use standard verses, an 8-bar drop, standard second verse, albeit with some progression into it that I will give it props for, into a 16-bar drop where you effectively, into a 16-bar second drop where you effectively have the same first 8 bars, and then you extend it, but with the vocals over it, adding melodies that you've already gotten before over a new drop. It's hard to say when I should give credit to certain tracks for doing certain things that in other cases I would give tracks credit for. Those are pretty much all the thoughts in my head. So when it comes to actually comparing this track does a lot of similar things to the Nurko video, but in ways that I can't quite, I shouldn't just say the Nurko video, into episode number 8, The Longest Night. In ways I can't really quite describe, The Longest Night just kind of does it a little bit better. And the reason I mentioned what I did about the preface is because it's hard to exactly put into words, but if you just have some reference points, hopefully you as the audience, as the listener, can kind of compare and contrast the two and kind of identify, okay, how come in Save My Love, when you have the second drop where you introduce the progression and you have similar melodies, it doesn't quite feel the same as in The Longest Night, where in the second verse, I should have said the second verse of this track, where in the second verse of The Longest Night, you also have similar melodies, but the progression just kind of feels more alive, and it kind of feels like there's more to it, and you get more nuances and character and flavor really out of the rhythm and the melody of the vocals. So again, those are your two reference tracks, which I do urge you guys to compare and contrast, which leaves me with this track, which essentially I feel doesn't have much character or much flavor out of the melodies and the vocals. I called attention specifically to the melody in the stripped area of the track, because the melody in and of itself was one I wasn't really, something about it just kind of feels a little bit kind of basic, a little bit simple, and not necessarily simple in a nothing left to lose type way, simple almost in a uncreative kind of way, or not necessarily uncreative kind of way, simple in almost like a soulless way, if you will, which again brings me to my gripes of this track. 4-bar intro doesn't really set up an experience. You get standard verses, a drop that doesn't feel like has much going for it, into a verse that doesn't feel like, into a second verse that doesn't really feel like it plays with the rhythms too much, into a second drop that feels like it follows a very predictable pattern of most commercial tracks at this point, where you have a 16-bar verse, a 16-bar drop, and the second one you throw the vocals on it, giving you a track that just feels very, very average and very, very commercial, very active, not in a good way. And overall, in my opinion, it ends up being kind of a soulless track. Okay, what is my conclusion to all of this? Because I know I said a lot and I tried to make it as structured as possible. There's 3-part conclusions to this. Number 1, it feels like this track, although it follows a similar kind of setup to Nurko's The Longest Night, doesn't feel like it has the same flavor and character, which is why I want you guys to compare and contrast the two, and maybe you guys agree or disagree with me. This is not one of those areas where I would say I am right and someone else is wrong. I hardly ever say people are right or wrong. I just want you guys to have a reference point and see if you guys can maybe kind of understand what I'm trying to get across. Number 2, this track definitely follows a lot of commercial patterns that you see out of tracks nowadays. A lot of things that I mentioned in other videos that I don't really like, that just gives this track a very average commercial feeling. An intro that's half the pacing of the track, in this case an intro that is 4 bars compared to this track's 8-bar pacing, a drop that is also the same pacing of the track, an 8-bar drop, into an average second verse that extends the second drop into 16 bars, copies the vocals onto the second half of the drop, and doesn't give you an outro either, ends the track right there, which just to emphasize, because I don't think I emphasized it enough, having an actual intro and outro out of Nurko's The Longest Night was so refreshing, and I don't want to take it for granted anymore, because I actually think that might have been the first track we reviewed that had that, and something that I really like that tracks have. And finally, number 3, when you look at the melodies, when you look at the progression, when you look at kind of the style of this track, it just feels a little bit soulless. Whatever that means is whatever that means, but again, hopefully by providing a reference point, you guys can check out maybe The Longest Night by Nurko, or maybe check out some other tracks that you guys like that you feel like have soul to them, and listen to this one and see if there's anything lacking. I'm going to mention a little bit more about that at the end after my rating, which we'll get to right now, but there's definitely something lacking out of this track that I feel like it's missing. Again, more on that in a bit. All right, so what is my actual rating of this track, Save My Love by Kygo, Khalid, and Gryffin? This was a really hard one to rate because I'm between two numbers and I can't quite decide. To some extent, you want to give this a 5 because this is about as average as it gets, right? And I do mean that. This feels like a pretty average track. The hard part about that is you then have to, I ask myself, okay, if I say this is as average as it gets and I want to give this a 5, what other tracks have I given a 5? I believe we're at 3. Which ones did I say? I said Starship's Rocketeer Remix, a track that had good things going for it, but didn't really stand out in any way. You take a look at Nothing Left to Lose by Jai Wolf, a track that had good things going for it, but didn't really stand out in any way. And you take a look at Deepest Veils by Last Heroes, a track that I liked, a track that is in a genre that I quite like, but didn't really stand out in any significant way. Now we take a look at Save My Love, a track that I described as average, that I'm tempted to give a 5 out of 10, which is average, doesn't have really many things going for it, and doesn't really stand out in any way, which kind of leaves you to the rational conclusion of, is this what a 4 out of 10 track looks like? What do you guys think? You know, it's really hard because when you start to ask yourself, well, what does a 3 out of 10 or a 2 out of 10 or a 1 out of 10 track look like? You really have to sometimes draw a line and say, you know what, maybe no tracks will ever be those numbers, because as long as you follow a few basic rules, you'll at least have something that sounds half good. And this track sounds good, right? It doesn't just sound half good, it sounds good, right? So you're not going to give this track a 2 or a 3 or anything. You know, that's why you're tempted to give this track a 5. But when you have your reference points, when you have other tracks, when you've started to kind of adjust your rating as something, as an average track, and meaning a good thing, that's why I've always said a 5 out of 10 is not a bad rating, it's a good rating. When you start to look at tracks that are a 5 out of 10 that have good things going for it but don't really stand out in a significant way, you can come to the rational conclusion that when you have a track like this that, in my opinion, again, everything is strictly my opinion, doesn't have many good things going for it and doesn't really stand out in a significant way, again, the natural conclusion is to draw at a 4, draw a 4 out of 10, which I'll probably stamp my rating on this track at a 4 out of 10. You guys can let me know if you agree or disagree. A lot of it is subjective at the end of the day. A lot of it is about how I kind of take in experiences and storytelling. What are all the words I use? I use progression, storytelling, and narratives, none of which in this track kind of stood out to me in any way. Does this track have progression, at least in the way I've defined it in the past? Yes, but it's a progression that you see out of pretty much every commercial track at this point. And again, when it doesn't really feel like there's a lot of soul to it, the progression is just there for the sake of having progression. It doesn't really move the track in a certain way. It doesn't deliver a certain experience. It doesn't feel like it kind of has a progression that stands out or a progression that really delivers anything to the listener. Pretty basic narrative / melodies, pretty basic vocals, things that don't really stand out to me in any way. And again, I have some gripes with the melodies. I don't love them. I don't hate them. They're just kind of there. Even the other tracks I have rated, I like the melodies and I like the sounds. This one, not as much. And when you look at the storytelling, again, if the progression is kind of the movement of a track as a whole, the storytelling is kind of how you go from area to area and how that works in with the progression of the track as a whole, which, as I've described, is going to be commercial, soulless, and active. I don't really think there's much going on for the storytelling here, especially when you have a 4-bar pacing, especially when you have a 4-bar intro, especially when you have a very commercial arrangement, and especially when the track just ends after the second drop, giving you a 3-minute and 30-second track that doesn't feel like it delivers much of an experience. I can't really say that many things about the storytelling either, which solidifies my rating at a 4 out of 10. And in order to have you guys hopefully challenge me in the comments for the one for you or watching this, Let's talk about what I mean when I say it's soulless, so you guys can hopefully agree or disagree. If you guys have seen my AI in music production video, a video that I'm still to this day pretty firm on, I think it's one of the most important videos I've made. I really kind of think that a lot of things I said in there are true. I left the audience with really one thought that I'm going to propose to you guys right now if you haven't watched that video. What does it mean for a track to be soulless? Still a concept that I'm kind of working on developing right now, what it means for a track to have a soul. But beside that, beside me still needing to work on the concept, I have one question for you guys that I also proposed in that video. What I proposed in that video was that with regard to AI generated tracks, there are going to be times when it's impressive and it's a good thing, and there are going to be times when it's not impressive and not a good thing. And I talked about how one standard might change how you think of not only AI generated tracks, but of tracks that are on, platforms right now. So what I proposed in that video and what I want you guys to think about with this song in this video is the following question. If I found out this track was AI generated, would I still like it as much? Again, it's a standard that I urge everyone to apply moving forward with what's going to be a lot of AI generated music. And it's a standard that I ask people to apply even now with tracks that may or may not, but we're going to assume are not AI generated, but still might feel like they are lacking a little bit of something. Ask yourself that question with this track. If you found out this track was AI generated, which again, I'm not claiming it is, it's a purely hypothetical question. I want to say this track is not AI generated in any way, by the way. But if you found out that hypothetically, if you found out that it was, would your impressions of the track change, right? That's kind of the lens I want people to think about, okay, when do tracks feel soulless, right? If AI generated this track, you start to really ask yourself, did it do anything significant? Did it do anything meaningful? Did it feel like it added some sort of life or character to the track? Or did it just feel like it took a formula, it took, what other tracks do, it wrote some lyrics, it wrote some melodies, it wrote some patterns, it arranged it in a certain way, and it put it out there? So there you go. Save My Love by Kygo, Khalid, and Gryffin. There is my rating, but that is about all I have to say about the track. So there you go. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Let me know if you guys agree or disagree. Let me know if you've listened to this track. Let me know how this compares to any other tracks by these artists. I listened to a little bit of Kygo. I've listened to a lot of Gryffin, but not as much anymore. And Khalid is an awesome, talented singer. Again, no hate to the track or the artist. These are just my opinions that I want to give on track reviews. And at the end of the day, this track didn't stick out to me as much. Not a bad thing, not a good thing. Just one opinion from one person who is reviewing tracks. Not the end all be all. Again, let me know what thoughts you guys have about the track in the comments. Let me know if what I said in the video makes sense, especially when talking about comparing and contrasting Narco's The Longest Night to this track. The Longest Night, a track that I give a lot of praise for how it kind of played around with instruments and melodies and rhythms and vocals specifically to kind of give it some life and give it movement, where this track, although it feels like it does it in a similar way, although it appears to do it in a similar way, doesn't quite feel like it does it in the same way and doesn't kind of get the same soul or life or character out of it. So let me know if you guys think that makes sense, and let me know if you guys agree or disagree with what I said there. Don't forget to let me know what you think in the comments. Remember, I want this channel to be a place of discussion, so make sure to leave your thoughts down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. But other than that, that is all I have for you. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.